Today we're going to go over 5 things that may help you fix your elbow pain. Now notice that I use the word may. They may fix, they may help you. This doesn't mean that this is going to be a perfect solution for you, but these 5 things are sort of a combination or a list of very low-hanging fruit that I've used to solve not only my own elbow pain during lifting, but also many clients of mine and many individuals that I have consultations with. So jumping right into it, what is the first and most obvious thing that we can do, assuming that a large majority of this elbow pain is occurring on elbow type motions, right? So biceps, triceps type motions. Well, the first thing that we can do, and again, this is all sort of precautionary and meant to be used as a starting point and not necessarily an ending point for you in your training, but avoid anything that is fixed in nature. So what does that mean? Well, take a skull crusher, for example, where you're using a barbell. Once you put your hands on the barbell, your hands are fixed. As you go through the motion, you can't rotate your forearms. You can sort of move your shoulders all over the place, but you don't have an opportunity at any point during the motion to alter your grip and change the way it's oriented. And in order to grab the bar, you really have to grab it in one of 2 ways. And so avoiding the use of anything which is fixed, which is going to create more restriction and less sort of individualization or less capacity to individualize, those are going to be things that in the initial stages of discomfort, you're going to want to move away from. Again, barbell skull crushers are, in my estimation, one of the more well-known sort of elbow ouchie exercises where, because people's hands are fixed, or at least in part because their hands are fixed, they have a low ability to actually adjust to a position that is most comfortable for you or for whoever has the elbow pain. So the first step is to kind of avoid something which is fixed. Also keep in mind that I'm not saying that fixed implements are bad. I'm speaking very specifically within the context of this discussion. And a big part of the reason that I think fixed implements can be limiting is simply because of the fact that you can't alter your grip selection within these exercises. So this is sort of a not to do, this is a negative, avoid the use of fixed implements. But then also, once you've avoided that use of whatever seems to be giving you trouble, then work toward altering your grip on the exercises that you are doing that happen to give you pain. So let's assume that you move from, let's say, a barbell skull crusher to a dumbbell skull crusher. Well, now all of a sudden you've created a freedom of movement, although of course your hand is tied to the implement, you can rotate it, right? And that's really the distinction that I'm making with fixed versus non-fixed. And so when you have those dumbbells in your hand, you can turn your hands as you do it, which may be more comfortable. You can orient the dumbbells in a little bit of a different way because you can sort of position them more directly, let's say, in line with the elbow, which is what we'll talk about next. You can do all different sorts of things just by virtue of the fact that your hands are no longer tied to a single thing. But within the constraints of you having altered your grip, don't get tied to a single kind of gripping method. So don't assume that you have to do dumbbell skull crushers this way, or you have to do them neutral, or you have to do them supinated, or that you have to assume a single position throughout the entire range. Play around with and experiment with what feels best. Does it feel best to stay in neutral and hold neutral? Does it feel better to maybe turn your palms toward your face and then turn them away from your face, right? Experiment with what feels good. Don't be afraid to work with some things that you maybe haven't tried before, again, because you've arrived at this place of elbow pain. You may as well experiment around with things that maybe aren't provocative or might not be provocative, again, because there are likely many of these kinds of things that you haven't tried. This could also, instead of just being dumbbells, this could be a cable, right? Where you have, a single arm cable extension or a single arm cable curl. You're able to position your grip however you'd like, and you're also able to change it throughout the range of motion. And so tip number 3, or sort of step number 3, which I mentioned or alluded to within the constraints of number 2, is to basically make sure that your elbows are aligned with the load. So what does that really mean? So think about, again, just to use the same example for consistency's sake, think about the skull crusher, right? Many people, and just start to pay attention to this around your gym, what you'll notice when people fix their hands to the bar is they'll kind of start in a position where they're tucking their elbows sort of inward and forward. And that's because the resistance is smushing their forearms directly backward this way, right? But what tends to happen is over the course of a set, or maybe immediately when they're actually loading their arms, what happens is their arms kind of turn out to the sides, whether it's just rotation of the arm, or maybe their shoulders change positions. And what ends up happening is people end up doing this kind of a thing. But sort of think about what's happening in this position. If you are able to use your triceps in this position right here, where would your triceps move your forearms? They would move them that way, out to the sides. But where is the load acting against you? The load is acting this way, right? 90 degrees from you all watching this video. So my arms, if I'm trying to load my triceps, need to be moving in the direction of the load. If I move my arms here, think about how ridiculous it would be if I grabbed dumbbells, I laid down, and I started doing this. Imagine me flat on my back doing this. The dumbbells will just be pulling me backward this way the whole time. It would just be like a shoulder rotation activity. So by moving from here gradually here, you're in essence moving in the direction of doing something ridiculous like that, but you're not quite there because you can still kind of find a way to basically triceps press into the bar. And so what I mean when I say align the elbows with the load, just make sure that the only thing the load is trying to do is smush your forearm into your, your upper arm. And so what that might look like if I'm not as comfortable here, if I'm, more comfortable with my arms out here, well, now all of a sudden I would need to maybe grab a cable and orient the cable backward and behind me so that if I turn this way, then I could just be doing a cable extension that way. Or perhaps if I am using a dumbbell, making sure that my arms, or a barbell, if you're able to do this, you have the mobility to comfortably do it, squeezing your arms inward and forward so that you can move your elbows in line with the resistance that is also in line with where your elbows are moving. So again, it's not that this is a terrible bad thing if it does happen, but again, if you're in this sort of initial stage of discomfort, pain, whatever it happens to be, you want to sort of try to check these boxes as mindfully as you can. So one of the things that will build all of this, and you'll notice that all these kind of build off of one another, is just the idea of making sure that you're open to different strategies within the confines of an exercise, right? So rather than doing 2 arms with a dumbbell, you could just do 1. So I'll kind of put this as a point, 3A, which is just the note single versus double. And what that essentially means is single versus double arm in this context, wherein perhaps regardless of what you do, you just can't seem to get one side to feel right. Like maybe you're doing both and one side feels good or one side feels better, or maybe it's like both sides still don't feel good. It's a good idea to opt in those cases for a single arm option because it's going to be easier on you for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's easier to concentrate on one side than it is on 2, especially if you have 2 free moving things like a dumbbell as compared to a fixed implement. But reason number 2 is that you can actually adjust your body more freely when you use single arm as compared to 2, right? So for example, if you're doing a single arm dumbbell curl, you can lean to the side and do the curl. You can rotate your shoulder a little bit more inward, right? Because you're not going to be smashing your hands against one another trying to do the curl. You can adjust your body in a variety of different ways, and again, find ways to align the resistance or to align the load with the path of the elbow. And when you do this in tandem with this, for example, a single arm curl, perhaps where you're leaning over, as opposed to a barbell curl, or as opposed to 2 dumbbells at the same time, again, it'll be easier to concentrate on the problem side or the problem sides, again, one arm at a time, simpler situation to coordinate. But then in addition to that, you can also manipulate your body in more ways to give you more options and potentially more room for individualization, right? Kind of alluding to what we talked about earlier, where you can experiment with different positions that may stress, the problem areas differently, and not only differently, but perhaps, a lot less relative to what your issues are. All right, so numbers 4 and 5 to finish out here. Number 4 is going to be adjusting range of motion, right? So this is kind of a simple one, but one that I think is still underrated, which is just, put simply, if I'm doing the skull crusher thing and I only have pain, in this bottom position, let's say I grab the dumbbells, I make all these adjustments that Ben maybe recommends, but it's just in that bottom position that I feel like still a little bit uncomfortable. Just avoid the bottom for now, okay? It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Get to, if this is the pain point, stop right there, right? And then gradually over time, when this starts to feel more comfortable, maybe go a little bit further, but maybe not, because maybe that's just what your body wants, and maybe that's what it's going to ultimately respond best to, whether it's in the short term or the longer term. And then the last thing that I would maybe, again, potentially recommend that might help is just improving strength. Like, I'm always open to this being an option. Perhaps you do have this elbow ouchie, this tennis elbow, this golfer's elbow, but perhaps it's because you're just ignoring training forearms altogether. It could be an issue of too much stress. It could be an issue of not being robust enough, right? Both, in my mind, are potentially viable options for why you might be experiencing what you're experiencing. Now, if you're someone who's really, really into training and like you're doing a lot of training, you're training intensely, like you're putting a lot of effort into it, I kind of find it unlikely that this grip thing is probably the cause. But if you're someone maybe who is a little bit less consistent in the gym, you know, you're not as planned, as calculated, you're not as regimented insofar as how you track things and progress things, then potentially this could be an issue for you, especially if you're doing all kinds of exercises which are never sort of loaded at the hand. So this could simply be wrist extensions, you know, with a cable, wrist curls with a cable, training the deviations side to side. Those are all examples of things that you could do. I don't want to start to sort of go down that rabbit hole, because then all of a sudden this becomes a video about how we can isolate forearms, which if any of you want me to do, drop a comment. But I hope all these were helpful considerations, perhaps some of which you may have considered, some of which you haven't, but ultimately give all these a try. Test them out. Don't become rigid and subscribe to any of these rules arbitrarily. Test it out, see how it works for you, and then sort of continually update what seems to be working well in your program so that you can sustain your program and your training longer term without these kinds of issues. Also keep in mind that what we covered today is just sort of one piece to the puzzle, right? Because there are many other instances in which you might have elbow pain, like during pull downs or presses. And what I'll just say is, you know, for now, I would just try to keep these principles in mind and apply those to the other exercises. So rather than thinking super rigidly about just curls and extensions, think about how this might apply to a bench. Oh, perhaps dumbbells instead of a barbell, perhaps cables instead of dumbbells. Alter the grip, right, in the same way that we talked about. Increase or decrease the range of motion. Make sure that, you know, your presses are comfortable for your shoulders as well as your elbows and your wrists. All these things are relevant players in those contexts as well, right? And keep in mind that these are principles, which means that they apply across context.